So, in the previous topic, we got familiarized with the Android Studio and we created a project called the Activity Lifecycle. But what is an activity? And what do we mean by its lifecycle? Let's learn about these two things in this topic. First, what is an activity? Well, an activity is a screen on your mobile phones which consists of the user interface. An activity provides the window in which the app draws its UI. Now, an app has many screens, and all these different types of screens are different activities. So, an app has multiple activities. For example, let's look at the Instagram app. This first screen of the app is called the main activity. Every app has a main activity, and it is the first screen of the app. Let's say we now move to any person's profile. This profile page is then a different activity. But let's say we now go to another person's profile page. Will this page be a different activity too? Well, no. All profile pages have essentially the same layout. It is only the content that changes. So all profile pages will be one single activity. Now let's say in this person's profile we open a picture. This picture screen will then be a different activity. But if we open more pictures, they will all be the same activity only. So we hope you have now understood the meaning of an activity. These activities of an app are all related. Let's say we click here. It then takes us to a different screen and hence a different activity gets launched when we click on this button. Now, when we are interacting with a new activity, let's say this activity, then what happens to this previous activity? Well, it goes into pause state and then eventually it is stopped. So based on this, we can make some general points about an activity. 1. We can say that the activities have different states like create, pause, stop, destroy, etc. We will learn about all these in just a bit. These states are attained by an activity because of some events. So we can say that an activity has different events like the creation or pausing or destroying of an activity, etc. All these events lead to a different state of the activity. Now, how do these events get triggered? Or how do these activities attain different states? The activity attains different states based on the user behavior. For example, when we click a button, we go to the next screen. This clicking on a button triggers an event and thus the focus on the first activity changes and it becomes paused. Now, when an activity attains this paused state, it will invoke the onPause method. So, we see that first an event is triggered due to which a state is attained, and then the method related to that state is called. All this goes on in accordance with the activity lifecycle. And what do we mean by the activity lifecycle? A life cycle can be understood as the life cycle of anything or person we interact with in our lives. A butterfly has a life cycle, a human being has a life cycle, similarly an activity has a life cycle. As a user navigates through an app or goes out of and comes back to an app, the activity instances in the app transition through various states in their life cycle. So when we write the code of our app, the activity class has a number of methods, which are known as callbacks. These methods are triggered when the various events take place in the activity. The various states can be that the system is creating an activity, or pausing or resuming an activity, or destroying the process in which the activity resides. Let's look at the various callbacks to better understand the activity lifecycle. We will look at 7 methods or callbacks here. These are onCreate, onStart, onResume, onPause, onStop, onDestroy, and onRestart. Let's look at each one of them one by one. And then we will understand how they all function seamlessly. First, let's look at the onCreate method. This is the mandatory callback method and every activity must have it. It is used to create the startup logic of the activity. Basically, it draws the logic from the code and creates the activity screen to be used. This method calls the onStart and onResume methods in quick succession. Next, the onStart method makes the activity visible to the user, as the app prepares to enter the foreground and become interactive. But at this stage, even though the activity is visible to the user, it is still not interactive. The activity does not stay in this state for long since the onResume is quickly called and the activity is then ready for interaction. Next, the onResume method is called when the activity is ready for user interaction. For example, whenever you open Facebook or WhatsApp and are using it to type a message or to view a picture, the activity has already entered the resumed state. And once it enters this state, the onResume method is called. Also, you must have realized by now that all these three methods are always called in quick succession within a matter of seconds. Now, the activity remains in this state till the user is interacting with it. It will change its state only in case of some interruptions, like when a phone call is coming or when the user navigates to another activity in the same app or when the device's screen turns off. So when an interruption occurs, the activity goes into the pause state. Let's look at the onPause method now. The activity moves to this state either when it does not remain in the foreground anymore or if the app window loses focus. The activity does not remain in the foreground means that the user has navigated to some other activity in the app. And the app window loses focus means that when, let's say, two apps are running simultaneously in a split screen and the user is interacting only with one of them. In this case, the other app's activity loses focus. Once the activity enters this state, the resources that were being used by the activity can be freed. Now, this state changes in two circumstances. One, when the activity resumes and is being used again, or if it becomes completely invisible to the user. Once the activity is resumed, then the onResume method will be called. Now the system keeps the activity instance that was last shown to the user in memory and recalls that instance when the onResume method is called. So you must have seen that when you move from one app to another and then come back to the first app, you come back to the same screen where you had left off. That is what we mean by returning to the same instance. Now, if the activity needs to become completely invisible, then the onStop method will be called. Let's look at the onStop method now. When an activity is no longer visible to the user, it enters the stop state and the system invokes the onStop method. This may happen when, let's say, a newly launched activity covers the entire screen. This state can also be invoked by the system when it needs more resources for other apps. For example, if the RAM of the device is low and it needs it for other functions, it can directly stop an activity instead of sending it in the paused state. Here also, we should free up all the resources. So let's say you get a call and are on that call for a long time, say for an hour. In this case, the activity first goes into pause state and eventually will get stopped. Next, let's look at the onDestroy method. This is the final call that the activity receives. This method may be invoked because of a user's actions, such as when the user stops using the app and removes it from the background also. Or it may be invoked by the system when it wants to free up space for some other important functions. You may have seen sometimes the app stops responding. Well, that's because the activity faces a shortage of resources and hence it is destroyed. Now, let's look at the onRestart method. Once the stopped activity is returned to the active state for the user, the onRestart is invoked. Okay, so now that we have looked at all these methods independently, let's look at this flowchart and make a consolidated understanding of how all these methods work together with each other. First, when the activity is launched, it gets created, then it starts and then resumes, all in quick succession. It is only when the activity resumes that it is ready for use. All this is done by the onCreate, onStart and onResume methods respectively. Now, when the user moves on to the next screen or activity in the app, the current activity goes into paused state and then the onPause method is called. While using Android devices or an app, we tend to come back to previous screens. And this is the reason that the previous screens are not stopped immediately, but instead they enter the paused state. After a while, the inactive activity goes from the paused state to the stopped state. Thus, the onStop method is called. Then finally, when we exit the app, the activity gets destroyed and the onDestroy method is called. This frees up the resources and memory that was being used by the activity. Also, when the activity is in the stopped state and the user navigates to the activity again, the activity started again and the onRestart method is called. Now sometimes, when the activity is in the stopped state, the device may need memory for other high priority apps, and so it destroys the activity. And so, when the user navigates again to the activity is created again and the onCreate method is called. Similarly, when the activity is in the paused state and the user navigates to the activity again, the activity resumes for interaction and the onResume method is called. But again, sometimes the system may need to free up the memory for other important apps. And in this case, the activity is destroyed, and if the user navigates to the activity again, the onCreate method will be called again. This is the usual behavior of the activity lifecycle. I hope you have a better understanding of it now. That was all for this video. In the next video, we will learn how to create these methods in Android Studio.